Right now, in the middle of 2026, something is quietly happening inside the world's computers that almost nobody is describing correctly, not because anyone is hiding it, but because it's unfolding in patch notes, government budget documents, and hardware press releases that most people scroll straight past. And that quiet, unglamorous pace is exactly why it matters so much. Because the biggest shifts in technology rarely arrive with a bang. They arrive exactly like this, slowly, steadily, until one day you look up and the entire landscape has changed underneath you. And what's actually happening is the slow, increasingly public struggle of Windows, the operating system installed on more than 1 billion machines and backed by one of the wealthiest companies in history, against a rival it spent decades treating as a punchline. Linux, the free open-source operating system that industry insiders once dismissed as a hobbyist toy for basement programmers, now sitting inside government ministries, national police forces, premium gaming handhelds, and a genuinely growing slice of ordinary home computers. Let's start with where Windows actually stands right now, not the version Microsoft's own keynote slides want you to see. Through the first half of 2026, Microsoft pushed a wave of Windows 11 updates built around features like point-in-time restore and pausable updates, tools specifically designed to help you undo the damage the operating system's own update cycle can cause. Sit with that for a second. An operating system in its 5th full year of release now leans on a dedicated recovery system just to survive its own patch process. That's not really a feature, that's closer to an admission. And it followed a genuinely rough stretch of months. Earlier in the year, Microsoft had to confirm that a widely deployed patch broke core Office automation, disrupting Word, PowerPoint, and Excel across some of the most common business laptops on the planet, with users reporting boot failures, BitLocker recovery loops locking people out of their own files, and blue screens on brand new commercial hardware. Around the same period, users separately discovered a bug quietly eating into hundreds of gigabytes of storage inside a hidden, protected system file most people never even knew existed until Independent. Reporters pushed Microsoft to acknowledge it publicly. And earlier still, a wave of shutdown failures and cloud app crashes forced out emergency patches, serious enough that Microsoft's own leadership in the Windows division had to publicly acknowledge that user frustration had become genuinely hard to ignore and committed a meaningful chunk of the year to reliability work rather than new features. Think about what that actually means coming from the most powerful software company on Earth. It means the flagship product running on more than 1 billion devices worldwide has become unstable enough that simply fixing it has to take priority over everything else the company had planned. That's not a routine year for a technology giant, that's damage control. And while Microsoft has been quietly firefighting boot failures and broken Office integrations, something genuinely different has been building on the other side of the desktop world. In March of 2026, Linux crossed 5% of the Steam gaming platform's user base for the first time ever, according to Valve's own monthly hardware survey, eventually landing at 5.33%, the highest figure ever recorded on the platform. That number matters more than almost any other statistic in this story, because gaming was supposed to be the one fortress Windows would never lose. For 2 decades, if you wanted to shut down any conversation about switching operating systems, all you had to say was 2 words: my games. That argument has genuinely weakened, and it's worth being precise about why. Because part of that March spike came from Valve correcting how it counts Chinese language Steam users in its survey, a technical adjustment that pulled Windows' reported share down and lifted Linux's proportionally that particular month. But even accounting for that correction, the underlying trend line is real and sustained, not a 1-month illusion. Steam on Linux sat at roughly 1% as recently as 2015, climbed to around 2% by 2021, and then accelerated sharply once the Steam Deck launched, ending 2025 at around 3.5% before that record-setting March 2026 reading. That's the kind of acceleration curve that tends to show up right before something tips permanently, and it isn't confined to gaming either. Independent tracking groups have placed global Linux desktop share climbing steadily through 2025, with the United States crossing 5% for the first time in mid-2025, according to StatCounter, becoming one of the first major Western markets to hit that threshold. So here's the question worth sitting with as we go deeper, because it's reportedly the exact question keeping people inside Microsoft up at night right now. What happens when the operating system famous for being unbreakable and completely uncontested starts losing ground, not from one single catastrophic failure, but from 1,000 small cracks appearing at once, at the precise moment its patient, 35-year-old rival finally has the hardware support, the gaming compatibility, and the government backing to walk through every single one of them? Start with the hardware, because it's the piece even longtime skeptics can no longer wave away. At CES 2026, Lenovo confirmed an official SteamOS configuration of its Legion Go 2 handheld. running Valve's Linux-based operating system straight out of the box as a genuine factory-supported alternative to the Windows version, a notable reversal after the company had previously said it had no plans to offer one at all. It's worth being precise here, rather than overselling it. This SteamOS edition launched as an additional option, sitting alongside the Windows version at a higher starting price. Not a full replacement of Windows across the whole product line, but the signal is still significant, because a mainstream global manufacturer looked at real customer demand and concluded that building and marketing a Linux-first configuration was now a sound commercial bet rather than a risky one, and independent hands-on testing comparing the two versions on identical hardware has repeatedly shown the Linux-based configuration pulling measurably higher and steadier frame rates in the same games. Lenovo isn't acting alone here either. Valve itself has continued expanding its own Steam Machine and Steam Deck ecosystem, and industry chatter suggests more manufacturers are quietly lining up behind SteamOS as a viable alternative to Windows on handheld and living room gaming hardware. None of this would matter without the technology quietly making it all possible, and that technology has a name most casual users still haven't heard, even though it might be one of the most important pieces of compatibility software built in the last decade. It's called Proton, Valve's translation layer that takes games built exclusively for Windows and lets them run on Linux without developers touching a single line of code. As of the current generation of Proton, the vast majority of Steam's most played titles run with ratings, meaning they either work flawlessly or with only cosmetic issues that never touch actual gameplay. And the independent community database ProtonDB now tracks roughly 90% of Steam's massive game catalog as playable on Linux, including technically demanding titles once considered the ultimate proof that Linux could never keep up. Cyberpunk 2077, Elden Ring Baldur's Gate 3, all running with performance that stands directly alongside native Windows installations on identical hardware. The newest Proton release pushes further still, built on an updated Wine foundation with kernel-level synchronization support that moves part of Windows' own threading model directly into the Linux kernel, cutting overhead and smoothing frame delivery across thousands of games at once, and it's already shipping early ARM builds too. A clear signal that Valve isn't just fighting today's battle, it's positioning for the next generation of hardware entirely. The old question that defined Linux gaming for 2 decades, can it even run my games, has effectively been retired. The real question now is what, if anything, a gamer would actually have to sacrifice to leave Windows behind completely. And for a growing slice of the gaming population, the honest answer is shrinking toward nothing. Underneath AMD sits as the dominant chipmaker among Linux gamers specifically, a direct result of the custom AMD silicon inside the Steam Deck pulling an entire new wave of users into the ecosystem, with AMD holding roughly 2/3 of the Linux Steam user base compared to a considerably smaller share among Windows Steam users. This isn't only a gaming story anymore, and it isn't only a hardware story either, because underneath the surface, the actual operating system has quietly matured into something almost unrecognizable compared to the clunky, terminal-heavy Linux most people remember from a decade ago. The industry-wide shift from the aging X11 display system to its modern successor Wayland, and transition the Linux community argued about for the better part of a decade, has now reached the point where every major distribution ships it by default, bringing proper HDR support, variable refresh rate handling, and multi-monitor management that finally matches what Windows and macOS users have taken for granted for years. Installing a modern Linux distribution now takes well under an hour on most current hardware, with no product key to hunt down, no forced online account creation, and none of the AI assistant integration that Windows increasingly inserts into every corner of its interface uninvited. Picture the full scene forming right now, a premium gaming handheld from one of the world's biggest manufacturers officially offering Linux as a factory option, a translation layer making virtually the entire Windows game library playable without developers lifting a finger, a kernel that keeps getting measurably faster with every release, and an installation process simple enough for someone who has never touched a terminal in their life. That's the consumer side of the story, and it's already enough to make Microsoft nervous, but it isn't even the most consequential part of what's unfolding. Because while gamers and hardware manufacturers have been quietly rebuilding the desktop from the bottom up, an entirely different group has been making a far more permanent kind of decision, one measured not in gaming benchmarks, but in national budgets and legal mandates, built around a single word, showing up in government strategy documents across Europe again and again: sovereignty. Roughly 2.5 million Windows workstations are reportedly scheduled for migration across the French public sector in the coming years, and this is not France experimenting blindly with untested software. The French National Gendarmerie has been running Linux since 2008, operating more than 100,000 workstations on a custom Ubuntu-based build known as Genbuntu. and the force has publicly credited that migration with saving millions of euros a year in licensing costs. That's not a theory, that's an 18-year operational track record inside one of the largest law enforcement agencies in Europe, and it's precisely the evidence the rest of the French government now points to when justifying a broader national rollout. France isn't acting alone either. Germany's state of Schleswig-Holstein became the first region in Europe to fully replace Microsoft's software stack with Linux and open source alternatives across its public offices, a transition it completed in 2024 and has continued expanding since. Denmark's Ministry of Digital Affairs launched its own formal transition away from Microsoft toward open source platforms, with rollout phases continuing through 2025 and into this year. And Switzerland went further than almost anyone else, passing legislation that legally requires software developed using public funding to be released as open source code, backing that commitment with roughly 230 million francs allocated specifically to build sovereign, nationally controlled cloud infrastructure. That's not a country dabbling in open source out of curiosity. That's a national government writing open source requirements directly into law and putting real money behind digital independence from foreign-controlled software. And there are serious, ongoing discussions in European policy circles around a shared EU-wide open source initiative for public administrations, a project that would have sounded fantastical a few years ago and is now being taken seriously in Brussels. Ask yourself the obvious question. Why is this happening now, after decades of governments quietly tolerating Microsoft's dominance without much resistance? The answer keeps showing up in the same word across every one of these policy documents: sovereignty, digital sovereignty. The idea that a government's own computing infrastructure, the systems running its hospitals, its courts, its ministries, its police forces, shouldn't be a closed black box controlled by a single foreign corporation, subject to that corporation's pricing decisions, update schedules, and data practices. Linux answers that question in a way no proprietary system can, because its source code is fully public. Any government, any independent auditor, any security researcher can read every line of it, verify exactly what it does, confirm there's no hidden telemetry, and modify it to fit national requirements without waiting on permission from a corporate headquarters overseas. In a geopolitical climate where data control has become as strategically important as energy or defense, that kind of transparency isn't a nice to have anymore. It's becoming policy. And the economic argument stacks directly on top of the sovereignty argument, because 2026 has been a genuinely brutal year for computer hardware pricing, with memory, storage, and graphics card costs all climbing sharply. In that exact environment, Windows 11's strict hardware requirements, which locked hundreds of millions of otherwise perfectly functional older computers out of eligibility, stopped being a minor annoyance and became a real financial barrier for ordinary households and cash-strapped public institutions alike. Replacing a working computer purely to satisfy a software requirement can mean spending several €100 or more in a market where nearly every component has gotten pricier at once, while staying on an operating system past its official end of support date means running with no further security patches at all. Linux sidesteps that entire dilemma, and independent enterprise testing has repeatedly shown lightweight Linux distributions running noticeably faster on aging hardware than Windows 11 runs on brand new machines. For a government, finance ministry staring down a budget spreadsheet, or a household watching an entire generation of usable computers get declared obsolete by policy rather than physics, that math is difficult to ignore. Government adoption gives Linux something it has genuinely never had at this scale before: permanent, budgeted, legally binding institutional demand that doesn't reverse itself easily. Because once a national police force has run a system for 18 years and can point to quantified savings, and once a country has written open source requirements into its actual legal code, walking that back would require elected officials to publicly justify handing sovereignty and savings back to a foreign corporation, which is not a conversation most politicians want to have in front of voters. So here's where that leaves Microsoft heading into the rest of 2026. It isn't losing the desktop story on a single front, it's losing ground simultaneously on the gaming front, where Proton and the Steam Deck ecosystem have quietly dismantled the last unbeatable argument for staying on Windows. On the government front, where national IT budgets across Europe are being legally redirected away from it, and, as it turns out, on the everyday software front too, the browsers, the Office suites, the creative tools, and the communication apps that used to be Windows' last unshakable fortress. For 2 full decades, the single most convincing reason to stay on Windows had nothing to do with government policy or gaming benchmarks at all. It was software, simple, everyday software. The argument that Linux might be free and fast, but the programs you actually need every day just don't exist there. That argument has quietly eroded piece by piece, and by 2026, most of it has genuinely collapsed. The browser argument went first, Chrome, Firefox, and Brave all run on Linux with full feature parity to their Windows. Versions, no missing extensions, no compromises. The productivity argument followed. LibreOffice now handles Microsoft Office file formats well enough that opening, editing, and exchanging Word and Excel documents with colleagues still on Windows causes barely a hiccup for the overwhelming majority of everyday users. Then came communication and entertainment. Spotify, Discord, Telegram, Zoom, and Slack all maintained fully supported, officially built native Linux clients today, not third-party workarounds, but real applications maintained by the companies themselves. Even professional creative work, the space people assumed would stay locked to Windows and macOS forever, has shifted. DaVinci Resolve, the video editing suite used across major film and television productions worldwide, has run natively on Linux for years, and tools like Krita and Inkscape have matured into genuinely capable creative applications working designers now use as primary tools rather than backups. Add up every one of these shifts: browsers, office tools, communication apps, creative software, and gaming, and you get something that would have sounded like fantasy even 5 years ago. An ordinary person switching to Linux today gives up almost nothing they use on a daily basis. None of this happens in isolation either. It's connected to something even bigger happening underneath the surface of the entire tech industry that barely gets discussed, but matters enormously. Linux doesn't just power a growing slice of desktops, it powers almost the entire infrastructure the modern world runs on. Every single one of the 500 most powerful supercomputers on the planet runs Linux, a streak that has held unbroken since November 2017. Roughly half of all server operating systems worldwide run on Linux today, and it powers the large majority of web servers whose operating system can be identified. Every major cloud platform, Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, and Microsoft's own Azure, runs the overwhelming majority of its workloads on Linux, including, ironically, much of the infrastructure Microsoft itself depends on to sell its own cloud services. The artificial intelligence systems reshaping the entire economy right now are almost universally trained and deployed on Linux infrastructure. And developers, the very people deciding what software gets built and which platforms get prioritized, are already living on Linux in disproportionate numbers compared to the general population, which matters more than it sounds like. Because when developers prefer a platform, they build for it more naturally, optimize for it more carefully, and advocate for it inside their own companies without anyone asking them to. A compounding advantage that doesn't show up cleanly in any single market share chart, but quietly reshapes an entire industry over time. Here's the honest, balanced part of this story, because exaggerating it would do you no favors. Windows is not dying tomorrow. It still commands somewhere in the range of 90% or more of the global desktop market, depending on which tracking source you trust. And for specific professional workflows, certain enterprise legacy software and specialized engineering tools with no direct Linux equivalent, Windows remains genuinely necessary for a great many people. That's not going to change overnight, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling you a fantasy rather than a forecast. But that was never really the question that mattered. The real question was always whether Linux had crossed the threshold from being a niche alternative that experts recommend and ordinary people ignore into something with genuine, structural, self-reinforcing momentum behind it. And by every metric walked through here, gaming share climbing to record highs since the Steam Deck's launch, a major manufacturer now officially shipping Linux hardware, national governments writing open source mandates directly into law, and Windows 11 itself lurching from one embarrassing reliability issue to another throughout 2026, while its own executives publicly admit the frustration is real, that threshold has been crossed. Windows isn't losing because of one dramatic failure. It's losing the way every long dominant giant eventually starts losing, through 1,000 small cracks appearing at once, right at the moment its patient 35-year-old rival finally has the hardware, the software, the government backing, and the accumulated momentum to walk through every single one of them. That's not speculation anymore. That's the story unfolding in real time, right now, in the second half of 2026.